They thought they got away with it. There are crimes so carefully planned that investigators initially believe the killer has escaped without leaving a single clue. No fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon, nothing. At least, that's how this case appeared in the beginning. The person responsible believed they had outsmarted everyone. They believed every detail had been planned, every movement calculated, every mistake eliminated. For a while, it seemed they were right. Police searched for answers. Investigators examined evidence. Friends and family demanded justice. Yet the truth remained hidden. But what the killer didn't know was that one tiny detail had already sealed their fate. A detail so small that nobody noticed it at first. A detail hiding in plain sight. And by the time investigators discovered it, the entire case would unravel. This story begins on what appeared to be an ordinary day. Nothing seemed unusual. People went to work. Families followed their routines. The world continued moving as it always had. Somewhere, a person was making plans for the future, completely unaware that they were being watched, completely unaware that someone had already decided their fate. Hours later, everything would change. A call would be made. Questions would begin, and a mystery would emerge that would leave investigators struggling to understand what had happened. At first, there was confusion, then concern, then fear. The victim seemed to vanish from normal communication. Messages went unanswered. Calls were ignored. Something wasn't right. The people closest to them sensed it immediately. Human instinct is a strange thing. Sometimes we know something is wrong long before we can prove it. That instinct would soon be confirmed. What investigators discovered next shocked everyone involved. The scene suggested violence. The evidence suggested planning. And whoever was responsible had clearly taken steps to avoid detection. This wasn't random. This wasn't spontaneous. This was deliberate, calculated, cold. The kind of crime that keeps detectives awake at night. As investigators began building a timeline, they quickly focused on a crucial question. Who had the opportunity? Every homicide investigation starts there. Not with theories, not with emotions, with opportunity. Who could have done it? Who was nearby? Who knew the victim's routine? Who stood to gain? The answers seemed to point in several directions. But one person appeared impossible to suspect. They had an alibi, a strong one. An alibi so convincing that many believed it completely removed them from suspicion. While the crime was happening, they appeared to be somewhere else. Digital records seemed to confirm it. The timestamps matched. The activity looked normal. Everything checked out. Case closed. Or so it seemed. But experienced investigators know something important. Technology records actions. It doesn't always record the truth. And sometimes the strongest alibi becomes the biggest lie. Weeks passed. Evidence continued to pile up. Investigators reviewed surveillance footage, phone records, location data, online activity, thousands of pieces of information. Most of it led nowhere, until one investigator noticed something strange. Something small, almost invisible, the kind of detail most people would dismiss immediately. Yet that tiny inconsistency would eventually expose a secret that nobody expected. A secret that transformed the entire investigation. Because the person responsible had planned almost everything. Almost. But almost is what sends killers to prison. And in this case, one overlooked mistake was all it took. The countdown to their downfall had already begun. They just didn't know it yet. The alibi that looked too perfect. By now, investigators knew one thing for certain. This wasn't a random crime. The evidence didn't support that theory. Random crimes are messy, unpredictable, chaotic. This wasn't. Whoever was responsible appeared calm, prepared, almost confident. Investigators returned to the timeline. A plan. The question was simple. What was the plan? Investigators returned to the timeline. Again, and again, and again. Every minute mattered. Every phone call mattered. Every movement mattered. Somewhere inside that timeline was the truth. They just hadn't found it yet. As detectives examined the victim's final known hours, they began identifying everyone connected to the case. Friends, relatives, neighbors, co-workers. anyone who might have information. Most interviews produced very little. People shared memories, speculation, theories. But theories don't solve murders. Evidence does. Then detectives encountered someone who seemed completely beyond suspicion. The reason was simple. Their alibi appeared airtight. At the exact time investigators believed the crime occurred, this person appeared to be somewhere else. Not just somewhere else. Documented somewhere else. Digital activity supported their story. Records supported their story. The timeline supported their story. Everything matched. Or at least it appeared to. For many investigators, that should have been the end of the discussion. An alibi is an alibi. Move on. Find another suspect. Find another lead. But something felt wrong. Not wrong enough to prove guilt. Not wrong enough to make an arrest. Just wrong enough to keep asking questions. And questions are dangerous. Especially when someone is hiding something. Days turned into weeks. Pressure increased. News coverage expanded. The public wanted answers. The victim's family wanted justice. And detectives needed progress. Yet the case remained frustratingly complicated. Every path seemed to lead nowhere. Every lead seemed to collapse. Then investigators made a decision. Instead of focusing on people, they focused on technology. Technology doesn't forget. Phones remember. Computers remember. Applications remember. Cameras remember. Even when people lie, technology often tells a different story. Detectives begin reviewing digital records in greater detail. Not hours, not days, weeks of data, thousands of records, thousands of timestamps, thousands of opportunities for mistakes. Because no matter how careful someone is, maintaining a lie is difficult. Maintaining a lie across hundreds of digital records is even harder. The deeper investigators looked, the more unusual things became. Nothing major, nothing dramatic, just tiny inconsistencies, tiny cracks, tiny details that didn't quite fit. Most people wouldn't have noticed them. Most people wouldn't have cared. But homicide investigators are trained differently. They're taught to pay attention to details others ignore. And one detail in particular refused to disappear. The activity appeared normal, almost too normal. Everything happened exactly as expected. Exactly when expected. Exactly how expected. And that's what bothered investigators. Real life rarely behaves that perfectly. People get distracted. They make mistakes. They change plans. Yet this timeline appeared polished, controlled, manufactured. As detectives continued digging, they started asking a new question. What if the alibi wasn't real? At first, the idea sounded ridiculous. After all, the records existed. The activity existed. The evidence existed. How could it be fake? But the more they examined the information, the harder it became to ignore. Something wasn't adding up. Something hidden beneath the surface. Something nobody had considered during the early stages of the investigation. If detectives were right, the implications were enormous. It would mean someone hadn't simply created an alibi. They had engineered one, built it, prepared it, tested it. A cover story designed long before investigators ever arrived. And if that theory was correct, then this crime had been planned much further in advance than anyone originally believed. The realization changed everything. Suddenly, detectives weren't looking at a spontaneous act. They were looking at preparation, calculation, patience. The kind of preparation that takes time. The kind of preparation that suggests intent. The kind of preparation juries remember. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. Investigators needed proof. Real proof. The kind that survives cross-examination. The kind that survives court. The kind that sends someone to prison. So they kept digging, hour after hour, day after day, following digital footprints most people never knew existed. And eventually, they found it. One tiny inconsistency, one overlooked detail, one mistake hidden inside a mountain of data. The mistake seemed insignificant, almost laughably small, but detectives immediately understood its importance. Because that single detail contradicted the entire story. Everything, the timeline, the explanation, the alibi, all of it, completely. The person who felt safest suddenly became the person detectives wanted to understand most. But they still didn't know investigators were closing in. They still believed their secret was secure. They still believed their plan had worked. What they didn't realize was that the evidence was already leading detectives straight toward them. And in part 3, investigators discover the hidden clue that transforms suspicion into something far more dangerous. The mistake they never saw coming. Every criminal makes mistakes. Not because they're careless. Not because they're stupid. Because they're human. And humans are imperfect. The problem for investigators is that some mistakes are obvious. Others are buried beneath thousands of pieces of evidence. This was one of those cases. The person responsible had done almost everything right. Almost. Weeks into the investigation, detectives were still searching for the breakthrough they desperately needed. They had theories. They had suspicions. But suspicion isn't evidence, and theories don't win convictions. What they needed was proof. Something undeniable. Something that connected the dots. Something that destroyed the alibi once and for all. At first, it seemed impossible. Every digital record appeared normal. Every timestamp appeared accurate. Every activity appeared legitimate. The story held together remarkably well. Too well. Experienced investigators know something important. When a story is completely perfect, it deserves extra attention, because real life is rarely perfect. Real life is messy. People forget things. People arrive late. People make mistakes. Yet this timeline looked polished, controlled, almost rehearsed. And that's what made detectives uncomfortable. They began reviewing the evidence again, not because they had found something, because they felt they had missed something. Hours of footage were examined. Phone activity was checked again. Digital records were compared against each other. Then one investigator noticed a discrepancy. Tiny, almost invisible. A detail so small that most people would scroll right past it. But the detective stopped, looked again, then looked a third time. Something wasn't right. The activity existed, but the behavior behind the activity didn't make sense. The records showed movement, but not interaction. The records showed presence, but not participation. At first, nobody understood what that meant. Then another investigator noticed something similar. A second inconsistency. Then a third. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they meant everything. Suddenly, detectives began considering a possibility that had previously sounded ridiculous. What if the activity wasn't happening live? What if the evidence everyone trusted had been created to be seen? The idea changed the entire investigation. Because if detectives were right, the suspect wasn't simply hiding their involvement. They were manufacturing innocence. And manufacturing innocence requires planning. A lot of planning. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer the picture became. What originally looked like proof now looked like a performance. A carefully constructed performance. One designed to create distance between a suspect and a crime scene. One designed to survive scrutiny. One designed to fool everyone. For a while, it worked. Friends believed it. Family believed it. Even investigators initially believed it. But evidence doesn't care what people believe. Evidence only cares about what happened. And what happened was beginning to emerge. Detectives reconstructed the timeline from the ground up. Minute by minute, second by second, every movement was analyzed. Every digital trace was examined. Every possible explanation was tested. The result was devastating. The story that once appeared unbreakable was beginning to collapse. And once it started collapsing, it collapsed fast. New evidence suddenly made sense. Old evidence suddenly became important. Witness statements that seemed irrelevant suddenly mattered. The investigation gained momentum. For the first time, detectives felt they were getting close. Very close. Meanwhile, the person responsible continued living normally, at least outwardly. They had no reason to panic, no reason to run, no reason to think investigators had discovered anything. As far as they knew, the alibi still worked. As far as they knew, the plan remained intact. As far as they knew, they were safe. They were wrong, because detectives had already crossed a line. The investigation was no longer asking whether the alibi was genuine. Now it was asking how the alibi had been created. And that's a very different question. One question seeks truth. The other assumes deception. By this stage, investigators were convinced of one thing. The answer wasn't hidden in the crime scene. It was hidden in the preparation. Somewhere before the crime occurred, a decision had been made. A decision to create a false narrative. A decision to manipulate evidence. A decision that would eventually become impossible to explain away. The clock was ticking. Every new discovery tightened the net. Every new piece of evidence reduced the number of possible explanations. And eventually, only one explanation remained. The person who appeared least likely to be involved was becoming the center of the entire investigation. The perfect alibi was no longer protecting them. It was exposing them. Detectives uncover evidence so damaging that the investigation shifts from suspicion to pursuit. The hunt for the truth is about to become a hunt for a killer. The net begins to close. By this point, investigators were no longer searching for a suspect. They were searching for confirmation. The difference is important. A suspect is someone you think may have committed a crime. Confirmation is what proves it. And detectives were getting closer. Every day, the evidence became harder to ignore. The timeline that once protected a certain individual was beginning to work against them. The more investigators analyzed it, the more unnatural it appeared. Every movement seemed designed. Every action seemed intentional. Almost as if someone had anticipated exactly what police would look for. But there was a problem. Planning creates patterns. And patterns create weaknesses. The person responsible had spent so much time building the perfect story that they overlooked something critical. The story had become too perfect. Real people are unpredictable. Real people make mistakes. Real people don't move through life like a scripted character. Yet that's exactly what detectives were seeing. The deeper they dug, the more obvious it became. This wasn't normal behavior. This was manufactured behavior. And once investigators reached that conclusion, they changed their strategy. Instead of asking what happened during the crime, they started asking what happened before it. That decision changed everything. Because preparation leaves traces. Sometimes more traces than the crime itself. People planning something often leave digital footprints, search histories, location records, purchases, messages, deleted conversations. And while deleting information might seem smart, it often attracts even more attention. Investigators begin reconstructing events long before the crime occurred. Days, weeks, even months. What emerged was disturbing. Certain actions that once seemed innocent suddenly appeared suspicious. Certain decisions no longer looked random. And certain coincidences stopped looking like coincidences. Piece by piece, detectives started seeing a larger picture. A picture that suggested this wasn't a crime born from a single moment. It suggested intent, preparation, patience, the kind of preparation that prosecutors love presenting to juries. Because preparation tells a story. It tells people this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a choice. And choices have consequences. Meanwhile, the person at the center of the investigation remained unaware of how much detectives had uncovered. They still believed the alibi was working. They still believed the evidence supported them. They still believed investigators were chasing other leads. What they didn't know was that detectives were quietly assembling a case. A very strong case. One that was becoming harder to explain away. Then came the breakthrough. Not a confession. Not an eyewitness. Not a dramatic discovery. Something much more powerful. Corroboration. Multiple pieces of evidence pointing to the same conclusion. Independently, separately, without influencing one another. That is the kind of evidence investigators trust most. Because when different sources tell the same story, the truth becomes difficult to hide. And now the story was becoming clear. The timeline, the digital records, the inconsistencies, the preparation, everything was beginning to align. For the first time since the investigation began, detectives believed they understood what had happened. More importantly, they believed they understood who was responsible. But understanding and proving are two different things. They still needed the final piece. the piece that would remove all reasonable doubt, the piece that would transform a theory into a prosecution. The final mistake. The investigation had reached a turning point. For months, detectives had been collecting evidence, reviewing timelines, comparing records, testing theories. Now, they were no longer asking if the alibi was false, had been created. That question led them to the final piece of the puzzle, the piece that changed everything. By now, investigators had assembled thousands of data points, phone activity, location records, surveillance footage, witness statements, digital logs. Individually, none of them seemed devastating. Together, they told a story, and it wasn't the story the suspect wanted people to believe. The more detectives analyzed the evidence, the clearer the truth became. The alibi wasn't protecting the suspect, it was exposing them. Every attempt to appear innocent had created another trail. Every effort to avoid suspicion had generated another clue. And eventually those clues began connecting, one by one, like dominoes falling. What investigators discovered next was shocking. The timeline that had once appeared flawless contained gaps. Small gaps, but important ones. Moments where the story stopped making sense. Moments where reality and the official version of events no longer matched. The suspect had focused on creating the perfect appearance. But appearances are fragile. Evidence isn't. And evidence was winning. As detectives continued pulling at loose threads, the entire narrative started collapsing. The carefully constructed image of innocence began to crumble. Questions became accusations. Accusations became evidence. Evidence became a case. The net was closing. Fast. For the first time since the crime occurred, investigators felt confident. Not hopeful. Not optimistic. Confident. They knew where the evidence was leading, and they knew the suspect was running out of explanations. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Detectives presented their findings. The evidence was reviewed. Every timeline examined. Every inconsistency explained. Every digital footprint analyzed. The result was devastating. The same evidence that once appeared to clear the suspect now pointed directly toward them. The perfect alibi had become the perfect trap. Because once investigators understood how it worked, they could also see why it failed. And why it failed was surprisingly simple. The suspect believed controlling part of the story meant controlling all of it. But investigations don't rely on one source. They rely on many. Phones tell a story. Cameras tell a story. Records tell a story. Witnesses tell a story. And when all those stories agree, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Eventually, the suspect was confronted with the growing mountain of evidence. The investigation had come too far. The inconsistencies were too significant. The explanations too weak. The facts too strong. The case moved forward, and what had started as a mystery became a prosecution. The person who once believed they were untouchable now faced the reality they had spent months trying to avoid. Accountability. The evidence was presented. The timeline reconstructed. The deception exposed. Every step investigators had taken led to this moment. A moment that proved something detectives have known for decades. Criminals don't get caught because they're unlucky. They get caught because the truth is difficult to bury forever. No matter how carefully someone plans. No matter how intelligent they believe they are. No matter how convincing their lies appear. Eventually, reality catches up. In this case, reality arrived through tiny details. Small mistakes. Hidden inconsistencies. The kind most people would never notice. But detectives did. And because they did, a crime that once seemed impossible to solve was finally understood. Justice would never erase the loss suffered by the victim's loved ones. It would never undo what happened. But it provided answers. And sometimes answers are the only thing left to find. This case serves as a reminder that technology can create illusions, but it can also reveal them. A carefully crafted lie may survive for days, weeks, even months, but the truth has a way of leaving traces. And all investigators need is one trace, one mistake, one crack in the story, because once that crack appears, the entire structure can collapse. The suspect thought they got away with it. For a while, everyone else thought so too. But in the end, it wasn't a confession that solved the case. It wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. It was patience, persistence, and one tiny detail hiding in plain sight. A detail that ultimately revealed everything. And that's how the perfect crime became the perfect mistake.